Good evening, Rowan. It's the 17th of July 2016 and it's about 8:30. And obviously I'm making you my usual Sunday evening video to reassure you I haven't been seducing any priests over the weekend, so you can relax once again. Because obviously I'm saving myself so that I can be with my beloved as soon as you're in prison. So that's something I've got to keep me going to look forward to. But I'll say a bit more about that later on. Anyway, I thought we could have a chat this evening about a talk that you gave at St Paul's Cathedral in 2013, not long after you'd left office as Archbishop of Canterbury. And the talk's entitled How to Save the World or something like that. It's something to do with saving the world anyway. And you're in dialogue with someone called Michael Battle, but I'm focusing on what you're saying, really. Um, so, here's the first quotation from that talk. The philosopher Mary Midgley wrote a wonderful book called The Myths We Live By, and she concentrated in that book very largely on the myths, the stories we tell ourselves about human independence from creation. Well, I haven't read the book, so I don't know if that's even true, but I would like to point out that you don't believe in creation, Rowan. Remember, because you said that people who believed the book of Genesis were misreading it, and I've already showed the clip from that video where you said that. Although, when it suited your purposes, when you were misrepresenting the story of Noah, you were then encouraging people to believe the book of Genesis, although not as it was written, as you were presenting it to them. So, you go on to say, we tell ourselves the story that we are not actually part of this world. I don't know who we is here because I don't tell myself that story. I think you're just making this up to try and make out like you've got some special insight into people, which is what you normally do, but really you just talk total crap all the time. A story about the independence of what goes on in our heads. Right, so there is an independence of what goes on in your head, isn't there? Because you don't connect with reality at all, do you? Or if you do, it's a coincidence. And I did talk about this in my last video, that you seem to think that you're the novelist and the world and everyone in it are part of your novel, the people, the characters in your novel, and you have the power to define the people, who they are. They don't have any independent reality. People have to be or become what you've decided they're going to be in the script of your novel. You say, we tell ourselves the story that we are not actually part of this world, a story about the independence of what goes on in our heads. Well, that's a good description of you, Rowan, but it's not a good description of me because I do connect with reality an awful lot, and I'm very observant and perceptive as to what's actually going on. And I've met a lot of resistance when I've presented this information to other people, particularly in the Church of England, but not only there, who want to believe a myth because it makes them feel more comfortable, you see. For example, people would prefer to think that there's something wrong with me rather than think there's something wrong with their behaviour towards me or the behaviour of people who they admire and think should be above reproach, really. So that was a story that was going on in their heads, and I met a lot of resistance in challenging this story that was going on in the heads of other people. And of course, there was a story going on in the heads of those psychiatrists who made up a pack of liars about me as well. So you're right that there are a lot of stories going on in people's heads, but there aren't any stories going on in my head because I like to look at reality and perceive reality and interpret reality. And if other people find that uncomfortable when I state these things, then that's their problem, and I've got no intention of changing. And I shall be suing anybody who tries to force me by any means, kidnapping, false imprisonment, drugging, or spreading scandal about me behind my back for decades. I shall be suing anyone who tries to force me to accept the narrative that they've invented in their head as reality. So you are actually talking about yourself there when you're talking about what goes on in your head, the independence of what goes on in your head, but you are not talking about me. So don't include me in any we statements where you're spouting this nonsense. A story about the independence of what goes on in our heads, a story about our freedom from an environment that we can do what we like with. Well, I would like to point out that you are putting on your posh voice for this video, but that is in fact very bad grammar, where you say, a story about our freedom from an environment that we can do what we like with. You shouldn't be ending the sentence with a preposition. You should have said a story about our freedom from an environment with which we can do what we like. So in future, when you're trying to sound like you're from the upper class, try and correct your grammar, because you're just making yourself sound like a fool. But that kind of mythology is really only another version of the poisonous mythology that tells us that we're not even dependent on other human subjects. Well, I'm not a subject, Rowan. I'm a human being. I'm not subject to anyone. So don't call me a subject either. You only say human subjects anyway because you think it makes you sound more intelligent than saying human beings. So this is what you're saying. So one of the first myths that has to be challenged and dissolved is the myth that the ideal condition for human beings is non-connectedness. I'm not too sure if connectedness is a word. Connected, connect. Well, connect is a verb, isn't it? So you've made it. I don't know whether you've made it into a noun or an adjective. I think you've invented this word, Rowan. You do invent words quite a lot as well. You invent words, you redefine words, and you use words in very unusual contexts where they don't really have any meaning. You've got an unusual relationship with language. Connectedness. Now, you do put this ness on the end of words where it doesn't really belong. You do this quite frequently. Contradictoriness is another word that you made up. And only on a tweet in the last couple of weeks, you made up the word not going awareness. And I might put this tweet into this video because you said something like, we need to come to terms with the not going awareness of other people or something like that. And what you were trying to tell me is that you're not going to prison. So I'm going to invent a few words now as well. You need to come to terms with your going to prisonness, and another thing you need to come to terms with is my not doing what you wantness. And not giving you what you wantness, and not having sex with you ness. How about that then? Well, if you can do it, so can I. Non-connectedness with one another, non-connectedness with the environment. Well, I haven't got any connectedness with you, and I'm never going to have any connectedness with you. And connectedness with the environment. Well, if you mean that means I should stop breathing out carbon dioxide or using fossil fuels, which you do come on to talk about a bit later on, because you are pushing this environmentalist myth in this lecture as well, the global warming myth. So you then say, some of you may know that there is a movement Mostly in the United States, I'm sorry to say. I don't know why you should be sorry to say that. Why would it make any difference what country it was in? So there's a movement, mostly in the United States, you're sorry to say, which is about transhumanity, liberating humanity from the constraints of flesh and blood, making ourselves immortal. Well, you actually mean transhumanism, which is part of the globalist plan, mainly for themselves. I mean, they want to put chips in other people's brains so they can control them, but they think that they're going to be able to merge with machines and become immortal and a superior race. They're going to evolve into a superior race and be able to rule over everybody else and microchip everybody else and who's left, I mean, and make everybody into slaves. So it's quite out of context that you've mentioned this, actually, and I think it may be predictive programming because although you're sounding disapproving of it in a minute, you are actually introducing the idea to people probably for the first time. And then you say this is about transhumanism, which you call transhumanity. It's an idea that has, of course, been thought of before, notably in the Garden of Eden, where it wasn't a very conspicuous success, and I'm not holding my breath for it to be any more successful in our age. So you're talking about making ourselves immortal here with transhumanism, which is the merging of human beings with machines. And you say making ourselves immortal is an idea that was thought of before in the Garden of Eden. Well, that isn't true, is it? Because human beings were created immortal. You can read about that in the first two chapters of Genesis, and then in the third chapter of Genesis, the serpent tempted Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the serpent, who was Satan, said to Eve that she wouldn't die. Eve said to the serpent that they could eat from every tree in the garden except from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God had told them if they ate from that tree they would die. So they were immortal, and only if they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil would they die. And Satan said, because Satan's very truthful, being a liar and the father of lies, Satan said, you will not die. So Eve ate from this fruit and gave some to Adam, and he also ate from it. And this brought sin and death into the world. So although you say this idea of making ourselves immortal, this was an idea first thought of in the Garden of Eden, which you don't believe in, incidentally. Um, the idea of making ourselves immortal wasn't first thought of in the Garden of Eden because people were immortal and they became mortal from eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as God said that they would become mortal, I mean, they would die. And Satan said, you shall not die, but he was lying. So you've misrepresented this biblical story, haven't you? Which is quite unusual for you because you always usually present them in such a truthful light, don't you? And it's a story you don't even believe in anyway, so I think you're just trying to sound clever. Well, that's the end of my first comment on this video, but I'm going to make another one in a minute.
Some years ago, the philosopher Mary Midgley wrote a wonderful book called The Myths We Live By. And she concentrated in that book very largely on the myths, the stories we tell ourselves about human independence from creation. We tell ourselves the story that we are not actually part of this world. A story about the independence of what goes on in our heads. A story about our freedom from an environment that we can do what we like with. But that kind of mythology is really only another version of the poisonous mythology that tells us that we're not even dependent on other human subjects. So one of the first myths that has to be challenged and dissolved is that myth that the ideal condition for human beings is non-connectedness. Non-connectedness with one another, non-connectedness with the environment. Some of you may know that there is a movement, mostly in the United States, I'm sorry to say, which is about transhumanity, liberating humanity from the constraints of flesh and blood, making ourselves immortal. It's an idea that has, of course, been thought of before, notably in the Garden of Eden, where it wasn't a very conspicuous success, and I'm not holding my breath for it to be any more successful in our age.
So you go on to say that the second thing is connected with the Millennium Development Goals and where exactly we hope to see those going after 2015. So you're talking in 2013 here, and the Millennium Development Goals were supposed to be achieved by 2015. Well, I've already made 2 videos about you and the Millennium Development Goals. And so you go on to say, and again, it sounds quite simple. It's not so easy to put into practice, but it is a basic thing, and that is the education of women. Right across the world, in any and every culture, one of the most transforming things that can happen is the education of girls and women. In so many contexts, a woman given freedom to take control of the circumstances in which she lives is a uniquely effective agent of transformation, actually delivering development at grassroots, in education, in healthcare, in microfinance. So here you are again, as I've said before many times, you're very hypocritical, championing the cause of women, championing the cause of the poor, when in fact your action towards individual women, notably myself, but also other women, I know that there's at least one other woman who was a student at Oxford University who you started maligning and saying that she was a lesbian behind her back as well. So I suppose she didn't want sex with you either. So this is a pattern in your behaviour. And here you are for self-aggrandisement, really, virtue signalling, championing the cause of women. And of course, you're promoting the idea that the only way to improve the situation of people who are poor is to support the United Nations and to involve ourselves in the United Nations agenda, which presents itself as the saviour of the world, the false messiah, but is in fact, of course, working in the opposite direction and is intent on destroying every civilization, forming a collective and killing off the majority of the population of the world. And UN peacekeeping forces are quite a joke because they usually do exactly the opposite. So then you say, and it connects with what I was saying earlier, because of course, one of the most damaging myths that we can perpetrate is that somehow the voice of half the human race doesn't matter, that the experience of half the human race can be disregarded at the level of decision making and indeed myth making. I don't know why anyone should want to be involved in myth making, but half the population of the world that you're talking about are women, and so women are a collective. Half the population of the world is a collective, and you're supporting and liberating women. And of course, what do you do with individual women and individual poor people? You try to ruin them and make them as poor as possible so that they'll come under your control. As poor and powerless as possible. Try and cut them off from all their support networks, ruin their employment and education and ruin their reputation and close every possible door that you can. So they're completely hemmed in and will either will go mad, kill themselves, or come under your control. That's really the only thing that you're interested in. And all this virtue signalling is complete nonsense because you haven't got any virtue. And as I've said, I don't know why anyone would be interested in myth making. I think we've got enough myths already. We don't need any more. So then you say, can we, in some way, keep that in focus as a clear priority, with all that it involves in challenging the appalling record of gender-based violence across the world? Well, I've experienced quite a lot of violence because of you, haven't I? Well, a phenomenal amount of violence, particularly over the last 7.5 years. Sometimes that's been physical violence, threatened physical violence. I've been sexually assaulted. I'm being attacked with remote weapons, and you're telling me to shoot myself and that other people are going to rape and murder me, and that I'm going to end up dead and all this kind of thing. So you're actually a very violent man. And as I've said before, it's only because you're such a pathetic little weed that you can't use physical violence, because you're getting on a bit now as well in your 60s. So if you could overpower people with physical violence, then you would do that. But because you're such a weedy little man, you couldn't possibly do that. You couldn't knock the skin off a rice pudding. So this is why you use all these psychological methods: mind control, gaslighting, and manipulation. Anyway, I'm not going to go on any longer with this video this evening, but I'll just say a word about my beloved in a minute.
Second thing is connected with the Millennium Development Goals and where exactly we hope to see those going after 2015. And again, it sounds quite simple. It's not quite so easy to put into practice, but it is a basic thing. And that is the education of women. Right across the world, in any and every culture, one of the most transforming things that can happen is the education of girls and women. They are, in so many contexts, and Michael, you'll know this from Africa as I do, in so many contexts, a woman given the freedom to take control of the circumstances in which she lives is a uniquely effective agent of transformation, actually delivering development at grassroots, in education, in healthcare, in microfinance. And I hope and pray that we don't lose sight of that as one of the major elements in our Millennium Development Goals. And it connects with what I was saying earlier, because of course one of the most damaging myths that we can perpetrate is that somehow the voice of half the human race doesn't matter. That the experience of half the human race can be disregarded at the level of decision-making and indeed myth-making. Can we in some way keep that in focus as a clear priority, with all that it involves in challenging the appalling record of gender-based violence across the world?
So I just want to, because I can't stop thanking you for bringing me and my beloved together, because I'm just so happy at the thought of us being together the moment you're in prison. So I have seen him over the weekend, and he's just so gorgeous. He's just so wonderful. We were gazing there adoringly at each other for a moment, but we're both saving ourselves, don't worry. We're not going to make a move until you're in prison. And I'm quite sure he'll be happy to take part in the flag waving as well when we have our photo taken to send to you when you're in prison. So thank you once again for bringing us together. He's just the most wonderful man you could possibly imagine, and I can't believe I've been lucky enough to meet him. So it's all down to you. Thank you very much for suggesting this idea of seducing priests. I can't imagine why I didn't think of it before. So I'll leave it there for now. Sorry I didn't get to arrest you in Manchester, but I had a lie-in and then I had to cook my dinner with Yorkshire puddings and so on. But don't worry, I will be getting to arrest you soon. So don't forget, be alert. Hasta la próxima.
Don't try to change me, you're wasting your time.